My name is David Lopez, Co-Dean of Rutgers Law School in Newark, New Jersey, and this is The Power of Attorney. And today it is my honor to introduce Elise Boddie, who is a professor of law at Rutgers Law School, Robert L. Carter Scholar, and a nationally recognized expert in civil rights law, and someone with a very strong practice experience. Greetings. Welcome, Elise.
Well, greetings to everyone in the audience, and thank you so much for asking me to join you on this podcast.
I've been wanting to invite you for a long time, so it's really wonderful that you were able to find the time. And of course, this is all during the quarantine. So first of all, how is that working out? How are you and your family doing?
Yeah, thank you for asking. We're all doing well so far. Knock on wood. You know, there's some of the challenges of kind of being in isolation with your family for extended periods of time, but so far all is well.
Well, let's talk about your background and your path to academia. You are a practitioner and really practiced at the highest levels for the longest time. Why don't you talk about that and how you ended up in academia?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because if you had asked me or told me that I would be a law professor when I was in law school, I would have thought that was really funny. I never imagined myself as someone who would be a law professor. You know, I'm somebody who, loves ideas and loves to write, and so in some ways there's a natural fit there. But my path to academia was a little circuitous. So I started practicing civil rights law at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund a little over 20 years ago, actually. It's hard to imagine that it's been that long. Yeah, I had a fellowship before that. I was at Fried Frank, which is a corporate law firm. I did litigation there. It was part of a fellowship jointly with the Legal Defense Fund. And so after 2 years of doing corporate litigation, then I moved to LDF and did a lot of work in employment and affirmative action, did some economic justice work, and was there for about 6 years. But I started to feel a little bit constrained by litigation as a tool. I wanted to think about issues of race and justice differently and more expansively, and I just really felt an urge to write. And as it turns out, a number of LDF lawyers actually do go into academia. We have a kind of a long history of that. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who was a law professor at the time, still a law professor, and she said, I think you should teach, because I was doing a lot of public speaking. Folks had invited me into their classrooms to speak to law schools and different other professional educational settings. And and I enjoyed those conversations. And so she said, well, why don't you go into teaching? And eventually I went to become a visiting assistant professor at Fordham Law School, taught at New York Law School for several years. And then I actually went back to litigation. John Payton, who was the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, actually asked me to come back to direct the litigation program at LDF. Which was just amazing in so many different ways. And then I decided after kind of the organization had settled that I was going to come back to teaching, and happened to land a spot at Rutgers Law School.
Well, talk about your time with LDF. Yeah. LDF, is one of the nation's premier, if not premier, civil rights and impact litigation organizations, and has been instrumental in so many major cases. Talk a little bit about your time with LDF.
I have to say, I mean, as much as I love the work that I'm doing now, there's just nothing in the world like it. Honestly, the lawyers they're some of the most brilliant people you will ever meet, but they are humble and kind and funny and just warm people, and sort of beyond even the work, just to, I have so much respect for them as people and thinkers and folks who are just, even those who have left the Legal Defense Fund, who continue to press for justice just in all the different kinds of work that they're doing. I stay in touch with most of my former colleagues, if not all of them. Some I talk to more frequently than others, but that was just a beautiful space, and I learned so much from everyone I worked with. It was such a privilege and such a joy. And I have to say, I mean, I knew in college that I wanted to become a civil rights lawyer. It took me 2 tries to get to LDS, and that's the thing. That's the advice that I give to people who want to work there. I said, you got to keep trying, because it's hard to get to the Legal Defense Fund, because there are a lot of people who want to work there. It was just a seminal moment in my life, or time of my life, and the lessons I learned there were just invaluable.
And I think you really bring that spirit to the classroom, but I know that your students really appreciate that you teach the true complexity of what it means to be a lawyer working in the social justice space. Yeah. I certainly remember, from my years of practice, that there was always this notion of internal litigation, and that meant when you were either co-counseling or working within an organization, that some of that litigation was as fiery as the actual litigation itself, in terms of trying to make these very, very difficult judgments, because at the end of the day, no one really ever knows. You need to make predictions about how persuasive you can be to a particular audience and what the result's going to be. And I think that's a big part of the joy of being an attorney. But I think sometimes even internally with your co-counsel, you can have some pretty fiery debates as well. So,
yes.
Yes. And so I know that that's something that you talk about in your class. Talk about some of your scholarship and what you're teaching at Rutgers.
So much of my scholarship builds on the work that I've done in my career, thinking about sort of new ways to rethink the way in which law approaches race and racial equity. So early on, I wrote a law review article that won an award about the ways in which people are excluded on the basis of their race, and sort of what I call the small spaces of everyday life, the streets, the sidewalks, the grocery stores, the lobbies, the community common rooms of colleges, and talked about how to think about that problem in legal terms through the lens of equal protection, and kind of how to sort of formulate a response through law, because I do try in all of the work that I do to figure out what can the law say about this. And that's not just formal law, it's not just doctrine and statutes and cases, but it's also kind of thinking about social customs as its own form of law, and the ways in which we've kind of become accustomed to excluding and marginalizing Black people within spaces. And that doesn't just happen to Black people, but just sort of that's been my area of focus. So a lot of my work is very, again, just focused on race and equity and criticizing doctrine and trying to make concrete suggestions on how to change doctrine. And when I teach, I have these competing instincts, which are that, on the one hand, I am somebody who thinks it is really, not that this is novel, but I do think it's incredibly important that students understand the doctrine. That I know, sort of as scholars and academics, many of us have critiques about the doctrine and what the doctrine says. And that's incredibly important, but I think particularly in the first year curriculum, that students need to understand the doctrine, and then you have to create a context in which they also understand the problems with the doctrine. And that's a hard balance to achieve in the first year. It's much easier, I think, in the second and third years, when after students have the doctrine under their belt. And this tightrope of both understanding and being able to articulate the doctrine, and then also being able to critique it, comes from practicing as an LDF lawyer. Because when you file those briefs and you make those arguments in court, you better believe that you have everything is airtight, and that you have a clear understanding of what the law is. And then you can talk about the ways in which you want to change it, or the ways in which your case fits within the law. So the scholarship piece of it, I don't assign my pieces or anything to my students to do that, but I do try to bring in that critique and kind of help students see the limits of law at the same time that we're teaching the power of law. And I think that's the most challenging aspect of teaching.
And I think the students see all the work you put into it and appreciate it. You want to talk about the Inclusion Project?
Yeah. So this is a project that I started a few years ago, and I started the project because part of what I saw as a practitioner, the importance of using multiple tools in advocacy. You have to not only use law, but you have to use media, you have to use policy. At LDF, we were based, LDF actually had 2 offices. I was in the New York City office, but much of my work was in other parts of the country, and as a practical matter, it made it hard to engage with communities on the ground who are most affected by the issues that we were litigating. And so when I had the chance to start the project, I wanted to pursue systems change through systems advocacy. So systems are, these kind of, in the race context, we see all of these, the challenges of public health, inequities in the public health system, and the school system, and the education system, and the criminal justice system. You have all these kind of compounding inequalities that make it really hard for people to live and to find jobs and to take care of their families and the like. And so the hardest thing about that kind of deep-seated inequality is that you can't just approach those issues through law. You need to work with communities who are on the ground, who know they know the problems, and they know how they're being affected by the problems. And so to kind of change systems, we have to work in partnership with communities. We have to work in partnership with advocates and lawyers. And being at a research institution, a wonderful research institution like Rutgers, where you have the University of Scholars, that's really exciting, because what you can do is you can create spaces in which you sort of bring the insights and wisdom and the research of academics and scholars with communities, and you learn from their sort of insights and wisdom of how they're being affected on the ground by these very complex problems. By having those, bringing communities in conversation with one another, it's the best of both worlds. And then and from those conversations, you can kind of identify what might work or what is working on the ground, and then try to push for that. And I'll give you just a quick concrete example from the COVID context. One of the things that I've been doing over the last several weeks, and the students from my civil rights class have been phenomenal with this, because in this time of crisis, I've been looking for best practices, like what are different states and cities and communities, what are they doing in this moment of intense crisis around all of these different issues: access to voting, access to education, public health, promoting access to public health. And I discovered that the city of Chicago has put in place this racial equity rapid response operation, which essentially created a structure in which the city of Chicago through the mayor's office, partners with community organizations, universities, community health clinics, local hospitals, and they work together to identify the communities that are hardest hit using racial data and data by age and gender and the like, and then to target resources to those communities. And I know, in the state of New Jersey, we've got a lot of different communities around the state that are struggling also. And so I was able to get this framework in the hands of state legislators, and now we're sort of talking about ways that might be operationalized through legislation and the like. And so it's just very exciting to be able to have access to students who are really engaged with these issues, and want to, do the work and are kind of researching around kind of policing practices and voting practices and education practices, and then taking that research and then channeling it out to people around the state and, also around the country, and saying, this is what we've got, what are you guys doing? And then, so we could kind of, in this moment, do work that advances equity and justice on the ground, and that's really exciting.
Yes, and and COVID has been such a disruptive force, not only for people across the globe personally, but also with respect to various institutions. And I know in our own backyard in Newark, you see that what for some may be a tremor is an earthquake for others. And so I know that so many of our students and so many people in the civil rights community are looking for mechanisms to address so many of these gulfs that really seem to be widening during this crisis. And here we are, we've seen so much change in our society. I'm very, very proud of what you and our colleagues are doing in this space, because I know that the faculty colloquium series switched to sort of COVID and looking at its impact on various areas of the law. I know in a previous episode of this podcast, we had Professor Christina Ho talking about COVID and public health law, and there's so much thinking going on in this area, and to see you sort of jump into the space in our own backyard, I think that's very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great things about this faculty, is that we have many people on the faculty who, not just theory, right? It's also practice, and how do we advance through our scholarship and in a research-based way, changes to the systems all around us. And I think one of the things, just on this COVID point, one of the other things I'm trying to do is to hire someone who can map visually the racial data that is going to be released by the state of New Jersey, and that's also something that I help to craft, and in partnership with the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, which kind of pressed and lobbied for that bill to be passed, and other civil rights partners and faith leaders who did that work. Once the data comes out, to be able to map it, but also map it in a way that is attentive to the underlying community context. So we're looking not just at which communities are being hardest hit, but then what were the underlying conditions and challenges that those communities were facing before COVID hit? What are the social and economic vulnerabilities of those communities? Because that will help policy folks, legislators understand the difficulties and the challenges that communities may face in terms of recovery, and that we need extra resources, extra attention to those communities that were socially and economically vulnerable, so that they can recover and get back on their feet. There's also, it's very humbling because there is so much power and wealth of knowledge in communities, and so to make sure that this is not kind of a top-down conversation, like, we're here to help you figure out how to solve your own problems, but to also sort of figure out ways to kind of create opportunities for communities that have that power and information and knowledge and know what they need to kind of, help them activate that. And going back to the Chicago framework, that was one of the things that I found so impressive, was that they work through this kind of operational system to have communities themselves frame the problems that they're facing and then identify the solutions. And then the city brings its resources to bear to make that happen. And so I like to kind of I like that model, because I think about that model not only in terms of COVID, but just in terms of the work that I'm trying to do on the ground around issues. The one issue that I've been focused on primarily since I founded the Inclusion Project with school segregation in New Jersey, which is a whole other, you could spend a lot of time on that as well. So I've been working in coalition with civil rights leaders and lawyers and faith leaders and business people to challenge school segregation in New Jersey. And I'm not litigating that case. I want to be really clear about that. We have some wonderful lawyers, Larry Lessberg at the Gibbons firm, I want to give him a shout out, and Mike Stein, Tashman Stein, who are actually litigating the case. I've been involved in, looking at some of the briefs and making suggestions and the like, but they're doing the heavy lifting. What I've been trying to focus on is, how do we create conversations about what school segregation is, and what does it mean in a northern state when you tell people that New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in the country? They just don't know what you're talking about. It just seems, we think of segregation as an issue that happens in the South. And as it turns out, most of the most segregated states in the country are in the North and in the Midwest.
How did New Jersey end up so segregated?
It's a combination of different things. So you have to, when I speak about these issues, I try to ground it in the history first. So the first thing that people have to understand is that we have a history of redlining in this country, which were essentially, policies that were adopted by at the federal level, at the state level, by local communities, and by private actors, banks, from the 1930s on through the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And basically what these policies said was, if you had a single Black person, and it wasn't just Black people, but it was intentionally focused on Black people, if you had a single Black person in a community, that the federal government would not back mortgages for houses that were in those communities. So essentially it was a policy of disinvestment, of withdrawing resources, preventing resources from going to integrated communities, while at the same time investing in white suburban communities. And so what that meant was, when you have communities that don't have investment, where there's very little wealth that is these communities, they're low income communities that don't have the resources to make sure that their schools are functioning in the right way, where the local governments aren't putting in sewage systems that work properly, and lighting systems, and they're not cleaning up the communities. The garbage pickup isn't done in the same way with Black communities as it was in white communities. So you just have this sort of systemic neglect and intentional neglect of these communities, and that affected the school systems. So you have the wealth, the flight of wealth to white communities, and that left Black communities and increasingly brown communities, Latinx communities in the state of New Jersey, without the resources that the schools needed in order to function. And because in America, we require, for the most part, students to go to school where they live, and then we fund our school systems based on property taxes, which is tied to the wealth of communities. That means that if you are in a community of predominantly low-income people and people of color, it's very likely that your schools are underfunded. And so, that's a mouthful to describe to people, but it's important to get that historical context, because that sort of system of disinvestment has been a trap. When you live in a poorer community, a lower income community, and you want to move to a wealthier community, it's harder, right? Because you sell your house, you're not going to get as much money for your house. And so because you're not going to get as much money for your house, it's harder to buy a more expensive house in a higher income community that has schools that are better resourced. And so that's why segregation is a trap. You have the added factor with New Jersey, which is that New Jersey is this kind of crazy patchwork system of 575 different school districts, 600 maybe in 25 when you add in charter schools. And so you have all of these teeny tiny fiefdoms of local power that we're in school districts that operate within these teeny tiny fiefdoms. And so what it does is, when you have all of these different sort of cities and municipalities and towns and boroughs, it means that, on the upside, people who want to move out of their towns and cities and boroughs and have the resources to move, they've got a lot of choice, right? They've got a lot of opportunity to do that, because they can find the town that kind of suits their own preferences. But the downside of that is that when you're in a system of deep racial inequality and class inequality, it means that sort of people with resources and opportunity flee lower income communities, and so you have resource flight out of those communities, and it creates just intense levels of segregation across the state, because the class dynamics, of course, are tied to race, because Black and brown people are disproportionately lower income. And so all of that just creates a big systemic patchwork of segregation, residential segregation, and school segregation.
Yeah, and well, let me ask you about the impact of COVID-19. I think one of the things that is really kind of causing a lot of anxiety in the law school and around the university is that Rutgers University is a great public institution. And it's a public institution that has always, I think, taken pride in being really kind of at the front lines of the American dream, as being a pathway of opportunity for everybody, who attends the school. But, we have a large number of first generation students who go on and do outstanding things. And in this country, public education, but particularly public education, has been viewed as sort of the great democratic equalizer. But I think what's causing so much anxiety right now is the understanding that there are these disparities in the quality of education across the country, and that really, I think people are really bearing witness firsthand that these disparities are actually growing much wider during this COVID period, and that you have communities that have been much more impacted by the virus. And then on top of that, you have sort of the economic dislocation and the challenges of providing education to students across a technological divide in conditions that we all know really vary from household to household.
There's tremendous power and opportunity and insight and knowledge and wisdom in our communities that is just being untapped, right? So this is, in having this conversation, I want to be really clear that Black and Brown communities have a lot to bring to the table and have a lot to add to the conversation. And we are making a grievous mistake when we say that this is just, that the contributions are one way, right? That you have sort of people with resources and knowledge and power sort of bring that resources and knowledge and power to communities. Communities give that back too, right? So I just want to be really clear about that. So, and in this moment of COVID-19, all of that is magnified. The crisis is there was a crisis before COVID hit, frankly, in many different respects in our communities, but it's just been magnified by this crisis, and because now literally people's lives are being lost because for all the reasons that we know, right? The lack of access to protective equipment, because communities of color, we have intergenerational families who kind of live in houses together. We're more crowded. It's easier for the virus to spread. And so part of, I think, what's so hard is that I feel personally a deep sense of urgency and a need for quick responses, quick reactions. And, what we're seeing at the federal level, frankly, honestly, what we're seeing at the state level is just slowness, right? A lack of any, from what I can see, any urgency to respond, and the need to get resources to communities that are being most affected. We've shifted to remote instruction. We have 90,000 kids across the state of New Jersey who don't have access to the internet. And the governor just vetoed a bill that would have provided resources for distance learning for children across all of our many, many different school districts. And so I personally feel just really frustrated about where we are. And at the same time, I also sort of, hope and pray that in this time of deep crisis, that we can come out of it with a greater degree of empathy for people who are struggling, people who are unemployed, people who don't have access to health care, people who don't have, have housing insecurity and food insecurity. The hope is that if white America, frankly, is also, is feeling these issues, that there will be deeper empathy for Black and Brown communities who have been struggling with it for so long. And so, on the one hand, I hope that coming out of this time, this very challenging time, that would be the light at the end of the tunnel, that we would put in place policies that could systemically respond to these very deep inequalities on the ground, because we need that desperately now, but we also needed it desperately beforehand. And this is where also just to kind of get back to the point that I was making earlier around segregation, this is, segregation feels like an old idea, and in many ways it is an old idea. People think about segregation again in the South, and for those of us who may be a little older might remember sort of the fights around access to public schools in the South and the 1960s, right, and the 1950s and all of those struggles. And the reality is that, again, because we are so segregated across the North and New Jersey and New York and Michigan and Maryland and other different places, because of that segregation, we don't see people who have different life experiences. We don't see their full humanity. It's really easy to sort of generalize and make assumptions about people you don't know and don't have a chance to know. And so segregation, it impairs I think our willingness to move forward with policies that affect and that can help broader groups of people, because we don't see people outside our immediate communities as being part of our community of concern. And so it's so vitally important that we challenge segregation for that reason, and also because it is what I like to say, sort of a load-bearing wall for inequality. If you think about housing, and I already talked about schools, if you think about the environment, if you think about the way that we police, so much of that is tied into kind of the perceptions around communities and neighborhoods, but also the ways in which policies are crafted to bear on communities of color differently, because communities of color are isolated. And so they're able to effectuate these policies, to carry out these policies that are so harmful, because we have communities of color that are lower income and that are sort of strapped, dealing with the crises of the day many times. And so, I don't know, there are lots of things that I wrestle with and I struggle with around COVID. The optimistic side of me kind of hopes that maybe this will bring us to a better place too.
One of the things that we have going for us is, that we work in an environment with these really amazing students who, as you mentioned, come from all different backgrounds, really, I think, reflect the richness of this country and are really looking for a way to make an impact. So, I think sometimes the students forget that we sometimes need them at moments as much as they need us. Do you want to, in our last couple of minutes, talk about some of the students and some of the things that our students are doing, or some of the things they might consider doing during this COVID period, and to be part of, shaping the aftermath of COVID?
Yeah. So actually, I mean, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that in my civil rights class, we use the class to talk about sort of doing research around what are the best practices that are happening around the country in this moment of COVID. What are people doing about housing? What are people doing about voting? What are people doing about the criminal justice system and policing? And they were all over it. I mean, they're not even really getting credit for this. This was on a volunteer basis, and they all wanted to help, and they all wanted to, spend their time outside of studying for exams to kind of help identify these best practices, which I told them that they would be identified. They're going to be identified as co-authored, and the co-authors in this report that we eventually end up producing. And I'm working with Susan Feathers, who's just done terrific work in the public interest space, to hopefully kind of get all of this compiled and then to disseminate it around the state and around the country. And so, as I was saying earlier, our students are people who are hungry to learn the law, but also hungry to learn the law because it's a tool for doing really good work that is community centered and that has sort of a concrete value to it, because it sort of helps people who may not have full opportunity to kind of rise to their potential. Our students are engaged and active and focused, and they're such an incredible pleasure to teach. And I've worked with I hire students as part of my project they've done research for me around the history of discrimination in New Jersey, students who are helping me to understand the impact of a seminal Supreme Court decision from 20 years ago and looking at how that's been interpreted around the country. So there are lots of really exciting things happening at Rutgers Law School. I think it's a really phenomenal place, and I'm so delighted to be here.
Yeah, I think we're very delighted to have you there. And just to close, I know that we share several students, and I was talking to one of them the other day, and I was asking him how his semester's going, and he told me, and remember, this is one of my students in my class, and he goes, Professor Boddie's class is my favorite class. And so I caught him and I said, you realize you're speaking to the dean. Do you want to answer that question in a different way? Because I'm sure what you meant was it's your second favorite class. He goes, no, it's my favorite class. I'm like, dang.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I actually happen to know that you are a very popular professor as well as a very popular dean. So that goes both ways.
Thank you, Elise Boddie, for your time.
Thank you so much. This was really fun.
The Power of Attorney is produced by Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations minutes from Philadelphia and New York City, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more about Rutgers Law by visiting law.rutgers.edu.